Hello, everyone. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am really happy to be back with you today for this very special book talk. I was sorry to miss last week's program. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's with us in the room. Also, the chat box is where you will add your questions throughout the program, and we will try to bring them into the conversation as we go along. So please participate there. We also have live captioning available today. If you would like access to the captions in a separate screen so that you can enlarge it and look at the larger context, we will put that link in the chat for you as well. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in this work. The book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. So I hope that you'll check out jwa.org to explore the larger range of programs and resources that we offer. We are very, very lucky to have not one, but two pioneering Jewish leaders with us for this important conversation, which, as you'll see, both builds on and expands feminist thinking with the lens of disability and Jewish texts. Our featured author today is Julia Watts Belser, who is a rabbi, scholar, and spiritual teacher working at the intersections of disability studies, queer feminist Jewish ethics, and environmental justice. She is a professor of Jewish studies at Georgetown University, a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program. She is a longtime advocate for disability and gender justice and currently directs an initiative on disability and climate change. And she's a passionate wheelchair hiker, gardener, and lover of wild places. Rabbi Belser will be in conversation with Dr. Judith Plaskow, a professor emerita of religious studies at Manhattan College and a Jewish feminist theologian. A longtime Jewish feminist activist, Judith has been writing and speaking about Jewish feminism since the early 1970s. She's the co-founder and for many years co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. She's the author or editor of several works in feminist theology, including Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective, The Coming of Lilith, and Goddess and God in the World, Conversations in Embodied Theology, which she co-authored with Carol P. Christ. In March, she will be inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame, which is certainly something for us to celebrate. And on a personal note, I have been learning from Judith since I was a small child, and I have been truly delighted to discover Julia's teachings more recently. So it is a real honor for JWA to be convening these two amazing women today. Welcome, Julia and Judith. I am so grateful to have you both with us today. And I also want to thank Carrie, who's providing live captioning for this session. And now I will turn things over to you, Judith.
Thank you very much, Judith. It's a pleasure to be here with Julia. So, Julia, I had the great pleasure of reading several chapters of Loving Our Own Bones while you were working on them. And on that initial read, it was very clear to me that it was a book focusing on the Bible, on particular biblical figures and texts through a disability lens. But when Beacon sent me the whole manuscript in order to write a blurb, I thought, no, it's actually a book on disability that uses the Bible as an entry point for talking about significant aspects of disability and ableism. So, which is right? I wondered if you could say something about the relationship between those agendas.
Judith, I love this question, and I think the answer is yes. It is. It's both a book about disability that uses biblical texts as a way to illuminate disability experience and help us think better about the contours and dynamics and implications of ableism. And it's also a book about what it means to read Torah through a disability lens. It's a book about biblical text and rabbinic midrash, and about the way that taking disability seriously can help us recognize dimensions of the sacred and dimensions of canon that have often been ignored. So I wouldn't want to choose one or the other. I'm actually really deliberately trying to hold them together, braid them together. In practice, I mean, it's challenging to know how to balance that, though. And I think it's something I was very aware of when I was writing the book. I do a lot of code switching, both in my writing, but also when I'm speaking about the book. I think about this in particular because I think so many disabled folks, queer folks, minoritized folks more broadly often have, shall we say, really complicated relationships to the Bible and to religion for very good reasons. As a rabbi and a teacher, a lot of my work is done in and with folks who have been really burned by religion, who've been really wounded by it. So I think there are definitely moments when I want to emphasize that the book is actually not about the Bible, right? That is to say, you don't have to care about biblical text in order to read the book and find it meaningful. And it's been very meaningful. It's been very meaningful for me personally, for folks to reflect that back to me. But I am also making a case that religion matters deeply in this world. So even for secular folks, right, who want nothing to do with religion themselves, right, I think it's really, the book is really grounded in a kind of argument that religion is a powerful force in culture. I mean, in that sense, I think it's making also a really powerful feminist argument that regardless of our own personal engagement with religion and spirituality, religious paradigms, even those that we want to push back against or disown, affect people's thinking, and certainly affect people's thinking about disability. And then I guess I would say also for religious readers, I want to make the case that it matters so deeply to bring disability perspectives into profound and subversive conversation with Torah. And that I want us to be widening the conversation that we have both about Torah and about the way that we think about canon. Secular disability communities have really crucial insights about like what it means to practice care, to do ethics. I mean, I think about at their best, disability activists, disability communities are making a really powerful, practical, pragmatic set of claims about the dignity and goodness and sacredness of disabled people's lives. And I see that as sacred work, right? And I want to also bring that into the conversation that we have about religion, about spirituality and the sacred.
Thank you so much. So you're talking about the way in which religion has wounded people, and about bringing a subversive perspective really brings me to the next issue that I wanted to raise. One of the reasons I'm so delighted to be in conversation about loving our own bones in the context of the Jewish Women's Archive is that it so clearly reflects and is immersed in decades of Jewish feminist work. And at the same time, it expands on that work by bringing to it the lens of disability, which has too often been neglected. So to start, I love that you never apologized for devastating texts or try to make them nice. In fact, you say in the book that you deliberately turn to the difficult parts of tradition, that you learn from feminist interpreters the value of confronting pain and naming harm. So let's talk about the first biblical text you deal with in depth, which is the awful passage in Leviticus 21 that lists the bodily defects that disqualify a priest from offering sacrifices. Would you talk a little bit about how you deal with this text and how your treatment of it is emblematic of your broader approach?
Yeah, thanks so much, Judith. This is something that I have really learned so deeply from you. I think about one of the touchstones for me as I was working on this book is your essay on confronting violence within text in The Coming of Lilith, right? You're talking about a passage in Hosea that's often like lifted up as a really like beautiful, stirring expression of fidelity and covenant, but it's wrapped in language that is suffused with sexual violence and brutality. Right? And one of the things that your work has really helped me name and claim is the importance of this method of not like brushing past violence within text. So that's a big part of my method, my work. I think that Leviticus 21 really exemplifies that for me. I read Leviticus 21 as a powerful and terrible witness to the pervasive presence of ableism in culture, to the way that certain bodies get marked as defective and then rejected. And I just want to be clear, Leviticus 21, I say bodies here because Leviticus 21 is really particularly about visible bodily difference. But when we're thinking about disability and ableism more broadly, it's really important to be clear that this practice of drawing tight, normative, constricting expectations about bodies is really also about bodies and minds, about how we're supposed to think and feel and perceive and move through the world. So I'd want to, as we think broadly, not just think about, visible physical bodily difference, the defects that get described in Leviticus 21, but expand that out to think about all the different ways that mental, physical, sensory difference and diversity gets marked and stigmatized and rejected. But in this passage in Leviticus, that's really centering around the questions of the blemished, right, priest who is disbarred from offering a sacrifice at the altar. It's the bodies that get marked as different and then that get read as inferior and undesirable. And actually, I think what's one of the things that's really painful here is that they actually get marked as like repulsive to or repugnant to God. So I just want to be like really blatantly clear that I don't think that text gives us an accurate assessment of God's own feeling, right? I think that's theological hogwash, right? I take it for absolute bedrock that God loves, cherishes, and deeply desires the presence of disabled folks upon this earth. So because I take that like for granted, I don't feel like I need a biblical verse to tell that to me, which also frees me from this obligation to like have to make nice with Leviticus 21. And as you said, Judith, I don't want to make nice with this text, right? Like there's something that just, I rebel against the assumption that I should have to make it work for me. I actually just want to say no. But I think where I've come to is thinking about it as a kind of deliberate confrontation. Every time I read that text, right? And it comes up year after year, I think about it as an occasion to confront, to sit with, to tarry with the fact that disabled folks And so many other people, people of color, trans people, queer people, poor people, elders, so many people whose bodies and minds get seen as like not up to snuff, right? Not measuring up, have borne the brunt of this kind of brutality for centuries. So in the chapter, in the book as a whole, I dive deep into some really fascinating rabbinic and medieval and early modern ways that Jewish readers have reflected on this text. It's really worth noting that the ancient rabbis, for example, also really work to minimize the impact of this text. I don't want to project feelings onto them, but I actually think there's quite a bit of discomfort about the implications of this text. So I find that really powerful, even as I'm also frustrated with some of the limitations of their thinking and want to push it further. But for myself, I primarily take this text as a clarion call to recognize and resist the way we humans script our prejudices onto God. And I hear it as a challenge, a challenge to recognize that and to do that differently, to do the real inner work and political work that is required to shift that.
What you're saying raises another huge feminist question. Obviously, Jewish texts are really important to you. I mean, you devoted your life to thinking about them. And at the same time, you feel free to question them and even to reject them. And this raises the crucial issue of authority. When I was a research associate at Harvard Divinity School 50 years ago now, it was scary to think that, I convened a small discussion group with a few feminist students to talk about the issue of authority. We were really struggling with the questions: if we can't always trust the text, if we can't find what we need in it, where do we find what we need? What's our source of authority in rejecting one text and lifting up another? And I don't think this is any less urgent a question today than it was 50 years ago. I mean, maybe it's more urgent given the way in which the Bible is frequently cited as a source of authority in our culture. So how do you navigate this question of what is authoritative for you?
Yeah, I think it's a central question, and I think it's becoming more and more crucial, not less. Some years ago, I was at a gathering of centered around disability theology, organized by Kendrick Kemp, a Black disability theologian at Union, who's working on questions of Black disability theology. And after I spoke, someone in the audience said to me, how'd you learn to read the Bible this way, like so bold and unapologetic? And I said, I learned it from the book of the Lord, that is Audre Lorde. And I think that this is a place where, again, I want to name the significance of feminist, womanist, mujerista forebears as really helping to articulate for me a sense that authority can be grounded in our own deepest, most sacred knowings, right? Like actually when the book is called Loving Our Own Bones. And I think I come to bones also as a kind of alternative sense of where deep knowing comes. But what's crucial for me is that I resist also a tendency to make authority only solely personal. That is to say, it actually really deeply matters to me to be in conversation with and grounded by other feminist, womanist interpreters, so that I'm not solely only articulating authority in the kind of private personal key of one. This is, again, Judith, I think something that has come really clear to me in your own thinking about sexual ethics, right? About the importance of grounding an ethic in community reflection. I'm struck by some of the ways that you've been thinking about, when we talk about something as authentically Jewish, right? How do things become authentically Jewish? Not just because we can like trace some direct line back to Sinai. I mean, you, of course, have framed for us the signature question of like, who do we see as having been there, right? The way in which androcentrism has so often written women out of the very marrow of the tradition. And so I think for me, the work of rethinking authority is also about finding these kind of deep conversation partners. For me, I make the case in this book that it is worth thinking with disability communities, disabled folks, activists, artists, right? That this needs to be, this is and should be a really robust source of moral, ethical, and spiritual knowledge.
Thank you, Julia. I want to bring in a question here that appeared in the chat. You use the word disability so comfortably. And as you know, there are a lot of euphemisms, alternative terms that people use in order not to use the term disability. Could you speak to your comfort?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, I use the term disability. I really embrace the term disability as both a kind of neutral descriptor of a wide range of different kinds of human difference, right? So when I'm thinking about disability, I'm thinking really broadly here about physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, sensory disabilities, mental health disabilities, neurodiversity, chronic pain, long COVID, right? I mean, like, I want to use that in a very open-ended way to acknowledge a wide dimension of human experience. And I also use it in a positive sense as a term of affiliation with a kind of dissident set of cultural communities, right? I have found and been bolstered by and lifted up by a lot of different formations of disability culture and disability arts. And for me, one of the things I talk about in the book is the sense of kind of coming into a sense of affinity with and interest in, curiosity about this term. Of course, folks, disability can be used in a very negative way, right? But I think for me, it's really worth claiming it. In some cases, reclaiming it as in this sort of neutral to positive, choose your own adventure term. I myself find myself really staying away from disability euphemisms, in part, I think, because I feel they're often working sort of apologetically, like as though there's something actually shameful about disability. And so we're going to try not to call attention to that. I think disability is like a deeply, disability is like built into the very fabric of human experience and human being and who we collectively are in this world. And so that's partly why I choose to just name it this way.
Thank you, Julia. I want to come back to something you said a couple of minutes ago, that deep knowing comes from the bones. And, this brings me to a third important area in which the book deepens feminist conversations, and that is around issues of immanence and embodiment, both of which have been central themes in feminist theology. Feminist theologians have critiqued the suspicion of the body found in many religious texts and have imagined God as present in and with the world rather than as separate and distant from it. And yet there's a way in which the emphasis on bodiliness and presence can feel rather theoretical in work, I mean, including my own, rather than concrete and embodied. For me, one of the things that's so gorgeous about your book is its deep affirmation and evocation of the lived experience of disability. And I think that came through just a moment ago in your response to the question. I mean, you talk in vivid terms about how wheeling through the world means having an intimate relationship with the ground. You talk poetically about your sense of spirit being bound up with bread and dirt and dragonflies, so the reader can really feel their presence. So could you talk a little bit about the centrality of this theme to the book?
Yeah, thank you. One of the first stories I tell in the book is about really one of my earliest spiritual experiences as a young child, holding my father built a sandbox for my brother and I, right? And I used to love to plunge my hands into the sand, and underneath the seat, if I got really lucky, some days I could draw out a toad, right? And I remember vividly one day when this toad, right, sat in my hands and just opened up her eyes. And I looked into her eyes and I knew that she was alive, right? That there was another whole universe within her. And I think that sense of encounter with the elemental world, with the more than human world, with the which I try to carry also into my interactions with human beings, right? That there is actually a whole world inside each of us, is such a central grounding place for me. When it comes to immanence and embodiment, I think the body, the visceral physicality of the body is also really important to me. I have always been drawn to feminist thinking about embodiment, and yet there are times when embodiment, immanence, right? When the body gets treated as a sort of ideal site, like, the body, like it's some sweet paradise. But actually, like, bodies are complicated. Bodies are creaky and sometimes extremely unreliable and frustrating and difficult and challenging and vexing. So I'm actually not that interested in the ideal body. I don't feel like I know much about it. I think I'm actually really interested in friction, in places where, one of the things I talk about is the feeling of my body and my wheels rubbing against surface and ground. I'm actually really curious about grit. When I think theologically, I'm really drawn not to some notion of like perfect God. Again, like perfection just doesn't really interest me. I find it kind of boring. I am interested in a God who has gotten scuffed up by the centuries. My joints ache when it rains. And I think there's something meaningful there, not so I'm part of what I want to do is to invite us not to fly from that, right? But to really think in and with sensory experience, embodied experience in its raw, complicated, difficult, actual state.
I love the idea that the body is as complicated as our texts, right? And there's no more an ideal body than there is an ideal text, and that it really re-raises the question of authority, right? Because how do we sort out? There's nowhere where we're going to find the perfect, unblemished authority. We're always going through this process of sorting, whether we're looking at our own experience or the text. Right?
I mean, where is that ideal priest to be found? I mean, who is that guy? Wrap him in silk or something, because he's not gonna last. I mean, it's a really, it's so interesting to think about the frailty of these categories. And I think for me, it's a feature, right? It's actually one of the things that's always drawn me toward Jewish texts is the kind of rockiness of classical Jewish discourse, right? The way Midrash, for example, doesn't try to smooth, but actually often makes more mess, right? I mean, Talmud is classic for making more complication rather than less. And so it feels really actually like a deeply Jewish way. I'm seeing in the chat, Emmett, speaking also about the way the ideal body can be so especially fraught for Jews. And yes, this too, right? The way in which here, I think a kind of investment in the non-ideal, the non-romanticized body actually feels to me to be kin in some way to a kind of Jewish sensibility that runs through a lot of classical literature.
Well, this is a great segue to talking about at least one of the biblical characters who you deal with in depth. And I don't want to lose that dimension of the book because it's so important and exciting. When you deal with biblical figures, you simultaneously open up new perspectives on biblical texts and offer important insights into disability and ableism. So it's very hard for me to choose a favorite figure of the ones you look at. But let's turn to Moshe because you have 2 chapters on him, and he's so central to the biblical narrative, and he's our perfect leader.
Or is he?
First of all, what totally blew me away, and I feel like I should say duh, is your reading of Moshe as the disabled prophet. Of course, we all know that Moshe pleads he can't lead the people because he's slow of speech and slow of tongue. But this disability, if it even is one, just vanishes so quickly after the first chapters of the Exodus narrative that it's easy to forget about it as we move on, or even to suspect that he's just being modest. That's how I've always understood it. So talk about Moshe as disabled.
Yeah, I mean, that reading of Moses as modest, as the most humble, right, guy is so familiar in terms of the way he has been received. But I take Moses's protest that he's not a good speaker very seriously. And particularly the Hebrew that gets used here, Moses describes himself as heavy of tongue, using a word, a root from kavod, heavy, that is often used in Hebrew to describe a kind of like awkwardness, difficulty. And so many, both classical commentators and contemporary scholars have suggested that there's a kind of speech disability at play here, right? Moses is often read as a stutterer. Sometimes there's a wonderful midrash within deaf Jewish community that claims Moses as deaf, right? But Moses's speech disability, however we want to understand it, I think I see that as really central to why Moses turns down God. When God says, go speak to Pharaoh, Moses says, look, I'm not a good speaker. You've got the wrong guy for the job. Right? This is not my strength. And I think to me, it's very interesting. I think I'm torn between two different ways of reading this moment, and I want to hold on to both. One, that this is a moment of what we might today call internalized ableism, right? Moshe has taken in that sense that he doesn't measure up, he's not good enough, right? This is the way, all the ways that all those negative messages about disability get underneath our skin, right? As disabled folks, as a disabled person myself, I feel that so vividly and intensely. And I think there's also a way in which Moshe here, is giving us a really accurate read of ableism in action, right? He is saying, as a speech disabled person, I know that my words are often minimized and overlooked and neglected, God, and I think you're making a bad choice by entrusting this, crucial message to someone who is going to be repeatedly sidelined. And I actually like holding both of these, right? I feel like the risk of the internalized ableism reading is it's just like, oh, Moses, believe in yourself, right? And while I want to say that, I also want to say part of what we need here is massive structural cultural change that shifts the way that shifts the power dynamics and reception of disabled folks in practice. So again, those two dimensions feel really, really crucial. And then I think what's quite powerful here is that we see Moses receive two different kinds of accommodations. First, well, actually, it's the second, but the one I'll talk about first, it's the one that gets the biggest play is when God says to Moses, okay, so take your brother, right? Aaron becomes what in disability parlance today we would call Moses's revoicer, right? Aaron is the one who will go with Moses and repeat his words in order to make sure that they get, that they are properly, fully understood. This is a powerful moment. Bonnie Gracer calls this the first reasonable accommodation in the Torah. I love that. And it's a really significant moment, I think, of seeing how, God's self changes the plan in response to Moses's protest. But the thing that's a little tricky for me about that accommodation is it basically forces Moses into, to sort of bend in order to match a non-disabled norm. And what's so powerful for me about the other access modality that's offered in those early chapters of Exodus is it's a moment when God gives to Moses the signs, right? The visual signs that are meant to communicate non-verbally to the people who Moses is, who God is, what this is about. And that's, I think, an extraordinary moment for also bringing home the sense that here in this moment, Moses is being invited to express revelation in a way that utterly disrupts the conventional speech-based paradigm. And instead, God gives permission, encouragement, invitation to use the language that is most kin to Moses himself, right? Use your body, use your way of being in the world.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's such a beautiful example, what you just said, of how your deep insights into the text and educating the reader about disability and ableism really come together seamlessly. You're talking in that chapter about God as an important part of Moses' access team in these two very different important ways. And then you suddenly do an amazing pivot that I think highlights a crucial theme in the book. You're talking about God as, on Moses' staff, and then you say that God has a staffing problem, that God gets frustrated with Moses. It's hard to get a resistant bunch of humans to do the work that God wants accomplished in the world.
Yeah.
And what's happening here is that suddenly it's God who's the disabled person trying to get others to do the task that God can't do God's self.
Yeah, thanks, Judith.
So yeah, talk about that shift and its role in the book and the disability experience that you're lifting up.
Thank you. Yeah, this for me was such a moment of, oh, wow, wait, if I turn the text this way, we get something really different. It started for me because there's a moment in this Exodus story that I kind of glossed over before that was really making me feel uncomfortable. And that's when Moses protests and says, look, I don't want to go, send somebody else. God gets mad. Right? And it's kind of uncomfortable for me because I sort of in my heart of hearts want God to be the sort of perennially understanding, nurturing one who's like, oh, fluffs me up when I feel like I don't want to do the thing or I can't do it, and I think this is a moment when I, as a reader, wanted some understanding from God and empathy for Moses not wanting to go out there and put himself center stage in a kind of before a hostile audience. I didn't get it from the text. And so it led me to think about what's maybe at the root of that frustration? How can I, how do we read that frustration? And so I started thinking about, right, as you say, God here also has an access problem. As far as I can tell, when God wants something done in the world, God has to motivate or cajole human hands or human voices, human bodies to get it done. And this is, of course, not a new theological insight, right? I mean, this is something that a lot of Jewish theologians have talked about in terms of thinking about I'm thinking about here Heschel's insight of, God is needing humans. But I think where I go differently with that is thinking about how that lands for me, how that resonates for me as a disabled person, right? As somebody who at various times in my life has relied intimately on other humans for getting big and small things done, and how vulnerable that is, how frustrating that is, how difficult that is, right? I mean, we can all, I think it's, there are so many ways in which that can leave a person open to violence and abuse, but also just on the in very ordinary ways, right? I think about having to always get someone else to move the flower pots, and what they do is almost always perfectly fine, right? It's fine. But in truth, I often wanted it just a little bit differently. And sometimes the frustration of that rears up, right? And so for me, it's been really powerful to think about God's moments of frustration when they crop up in the Hebrew Bible as perhaps stemming in part from this need, right? This kind of, I'll say it, right? This kind of moment of this kind of reading that as a kind of disability experience, or at least an experience that disabled people know intimately, right? Of having to rely on others, and others don't always do the job right or exactly as you wanted it. And I think for me, part of the power of that image is to recognize, to invest in thinking about God as one who knows disability experience from the inside. I find that really personally moving and meaningful, but I also find that it is a really salutary cultural, religious, political challenge to the idea that what we should ultimately all aspire toward, right, is this notion of independence, perfection, invulnerability, right? I think that's bogus. I don't think we ever get that. And I think there's a real risk in the way that Judith, you and so many other feminist theologians have pointed out, that we often take the characteristics we most idealize in humans and project them onto God, and vice versa. Read God's attributes and characteristics, right, as the most valorized things we want or like or wish to see in humans, right? And so that's partly why I'm really invested in giving us cracking open new ways to think about the divine that aren't solely always invested in this idea of invulnerability and perfection.
That's so beautiful, Julia. And you're talking about God's frustration and your own frustration. Really connects to your second chapter on Moses, which I love. Maybe that was my favorite chapter, on the land that he cannot enter. And, here you deal with a very difficult and vulnerable issue, the ways in which disability involves limit. Moshe wants to enter the promised land, but he can't. And you can't take the walk on the mountain that you might long to take. You point out that the danger of this topic is that the dominant way of understanding disability in our culture is as loss. So as soon as you talk about the land you can't enter, the pity party, right? The pity party begins. And you say that disabled folks spend a lot of time managing the feelings of non-disabled people around loss. Would you talk about this important way in which ableism shapes the lives of people with disabilities?
Thanks so much, Judith, for this question and for laying out the stakes so powerfully, because I think this was for me the chapter that felt the riskiest, right? The one where, and that's in large part because of what you named, right? I learned early on, this is particularly after I became a wheelchair user. I was born with a disability, but when my disability changed pretty suddenly in my late teens, early 20s, and I became a wheelchair user, I learned very early on how intensely smothered I felt by other people's stories about tragedy and loss and despair, and like agony and pain and all that stuff, right? It was like an oppressive blanket that I couldn't ever, like I had to fight my way free of. And because of that, I felt a real pressure to tell a celebratory story about disability. And, I'm really clear that it matters to me deeply to claim and honor and celebrate disability joy. But I also, alongside that, want to make space for honoring and holding disabled grief and loss. for being able to widen the palette, the emotional registers that we are allowed to use. And here I'm thinking particularly about making more space for disabled folks to be able to speak about and acknowledge complexity, difficulty, loss, frustration, without having that immediately be subsumed into a story of disability is terrible, disability is woe. Wouldn't you rather be non-disabled? Wouldn't you, your life is so unlivable? Like all of this work that is, all of these paradigms and tropes that are both personally oppressive, but also politically devastating and dangerous, right? And I think in that chapter, I'm really thinking about what it means to sit with Moses as someone who lives much of his, right? Much of his, sort of peak spiritual life, knowing he will never enter the land. And he grieves it. And realizing how much I wanted Moses, right? As I read those passages, like wanting Moses not to want it, right? Like, don't want something that you're not going to get. And then coming around to realize, like, actually, maybe that's a very poignant, powerful, beautiful expression of actually this kind of widening, allowing Moses his lament. At the same time, we also know that Moses's life, limbed in by limits as it is also brilliant, beautiful, profound, exemplary, extraordinary.
When I first read this chapter, I asked you, don't we all have lands we cannot enter? And I was thinking of a friend who's tone deaf, who once said that if she could sing, her whole life would have been different. And I think we can all name something like that in our lives that we deeply wish for as a talent, a capacity that we don't have. And for me, part of the power of your book, and indeed of disability theory more generally, is that it provides deep insights into what it means to be human. I mean, as Rosemary Garland Thompson says, if we live long enough, we'll all be disabled. And, as somebody who's getting old, I know what she's talking about. And on the other hand, you say in the chapter on Jacob that while disability is an important aspect of what it means to be human, you don't want to only universalize, that it's important to recognize disability as difference. So let's talk a little bit about this tension.
Yeah. I mean, Judith, what you're naming and what I'm seeing some wonderful comments about this in the chat. Judith Rosenbaum also talks about, right, how all bodies are limited and non-disabled people often project that fear and frustration onto the bodies of disabled people. I think this, to me, this feels so true that, of course, like limit is a deeply human part of everyone's experience. And there's also something particular here going on around disability. I think often one of the reasons I'm resistant to a complete universalizing here is the way in which disabled folks often sort of function as like cultural icons of limit and limitation. And so I think it's also why I want to be really careful about the way we talk about limits. And I don't want to become like an icon of limitation in the same way I don't want to become an icon of loss. There's also like a huge political dimension here about like who experiences limits and why. A lot of times our thinking about limits goes very quickly toward the individual and fails to recognize the way in which there's social, structural, political choices that shape who experiences limitation in what spaces and why. Right? And so also politically, I want us to always be asking the question of how did certain kinds of limits get like socially produced and reinforced and created? And then how do we crack those open and push for a more capacious cultural, political, public sphere and space? I think that, but I think I would kind of come around to the recognition that this is one of the places where I think the Torah that comes through deep interaction with disability experience is not just Torah for disabled folks. Right? This is partly why I think disability Torah can and is life-giving and transformative for all of us. We all have bodies that creak and crumble, right? We all need rest and care. Of course, some of us experience much more, right? Like live much closer to the like vulnerable, risky, edgy places where we are at risk of being like run roughshod or run out of but all of us, every human being, right, experiences these in one way or another, experiences these kind of reality. Like ableism is bad news for all of us, right? It's not good for anyone with a body, for anyone with a mind. And so in that sense, I think at the heart of the book is also really a call for all of us, regardless of how we situate ourselves vis-a-vis disability, to reckon with the way in which the hegemonic norms around pace and productivity and excellence and strength and capacity and the ability to like tough it out and go it alone, that stuff is brutal for all of us.
I think that the power of disability Torah is evident in all that you've said today. Thank you so much. And everybody go and buy the book, which is a rich, wonderful book. Thank you, Julia.
Judith, you're muted.
It always happens. Thank you both so much, Julia and Judith, for this really powerful and heart-opening conversation. Our work at JWA is about expanding the narrative and shifting who's at the center, and it is work that is never finished. And this conversation is a really important reminder and challenge to us to make sure that we keep expanding and keep learning, and that we draw on many different ways of knowing, and that we think really carefully and inquisitively about where we locate authority. So thank you for being our teachers, for bringing this important Torah to us. I want to point people to other sources at JWA to continue learning. You can learn more about Rabbi Julia Watts Belser in our This Week in History entry about her and her work. You can learn more about Judith Plaskow's work in our encyclopedia and in our online exhibit on feminism and Jewish women. You can also read the article she wrote for our encyclopedia about feminist theology. You can learn more about many different Jewish women who are disability justice activists. I'll name a few. Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, with whom we did a recent interview, Judy Heumann, who sadly died last year. We have an encyclopedia entry and a podcast episode with her. Marilyn Goldman, Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, and many more. You can also listen to a recent podcast episode we did about disabled Jewish activists, which was very powerful. Thank you all for being with us today. Those who are new, those who have been with us since March 2020, we hope you'll join us next Thursday, January 25th. back at our usual 8 p.m. Eastern time slot for a conversation with Susan Kahn on her book, Canine Pioneer, The Extraordinary Life of Rudolfina Menzel, who was a groundbreaking scientist on canine psychology who helped create the infrastructure for dog research, training, and breeding in Israel. It is a really crazy story. Even if you're not a dog lover, I promise it will be very interesting. Thank you all again. And until next time, wishing you a wonderful week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.